I had just drawn the bolt across the barn door when I heard the sharp, uneven clatter of hooves on frozen ground far too close to the house at this hour. The sun had long since dipped behind the ridge, leaving the yard in the bluish shadow of early winter dusk. A rider emerged from the cottonwood's horse-lathered steam curling from its nostrils into the cold air. Whoever it was didn't slow until they reached my porch boots, hitting the planks before the animal had fully stopped. The knock came fast, hard enough to rattle the glass in the window. My hand hovered at the latch, not yet knowing whether to open the door or keep the night outside. Before I tell you what happened next, let me know where you're listening from in the comments and tap like and subscribe if you've ever stood at a crossroads where one choice could change everything. I'm Clara Donovan, born and raised on a patch of land 3 miles south of Clearwater. My folks were plain people. Ma kept the Sabbath table clean and the hymnal open. Pa worked sunup to sundown without complaint. They taught me early that you don't leave a man or beast hungry, and you don't take what's not yours, no matter who's watching. I married young to Thomas Donovan, a man who shared my belief that a homestead was worth the work it demanded. Together we built our place board by board, fence by fence, and when the roof was sound, we brought Samuel into the world. He grew up knowing the value of a day's labor, the comfort of a warm fire, and the steady rhythm of seasons that told you when to plant and when to pray for rain. Life on the edge of town kept us away from its finer things. No grand lamps, no imported fabrics, no hot baths unless you boiled the water yourself. We mended what we had and made do without the rest. But in town, money had begun to move like the river after a storm. The railroad men were buying up parcels, the mayor's office swelling with talk of progress that didn't have room for folks like us. Mayor Crow could shake a man's hand in church on Sunday and sign his land away on Monday so long as the price was right for the buyers. When Thomas passed, it was Elias Mercer who helped me keep the cattle watered and the fences mended. Folks said he was the last of the old guard, the kind who believed a neighbor's trouble was your own until it was mended. Still, even Elias couldn't change the fact that the town's appetite for land had grown sharp. I'd heard whispers about a new line running straight through our valley, cutting fences and fields alike. The kind of talk you hope is only gossip until a rider comes hard to your door after dark. I set the lantern on the table and moved to the door, the boards creaking under my boots. Through the glass I could see the rider's breath in the air, a hat pulled low against the wind, something clutched in his gloved hand. I had the uneasy feeling that whatever news he carried would not wait for morning. My fingers rested on the latch. Elias Mercer stood in the doorway, his hat brim dusted with frost eyes sharp under the porch lantern's glow. In his gloved hand was a folded envelope, the paper creased from the ride. "Clara," he said, his voice low enough the wind nearly carried it away. This came down from the mayor's office. Jedediah Crow sent it by way of the telegraph clerk, but I reckoned it best you hear it from a friend. He stepped inside, stamping the cold from his boots, the boards creaking under his weight. The smell of horse and cold air followed him in as I shut the door against the night. I led him to the table, the lamplight pooling between us. His fingers hesitated at the seal, then he slid it across to me. The envelope felt heavier than its paper weight, the wax still unbroken, a bold red stamp showing the county's crest. My hands stayed still for a moment, as if breaking that seal might let in more than just words. Outside, the wind rattled the bare branches against the window pane. Elias kept his eyes on me, his jaw tight, waiting. When I pulled the seal free, the letter inside was short and to the point. By order of the mayor's office, all parcels lying east of the cottonwood stand were to be surveyed for railroad passage within the month. Mine was among them. It did not ask my consent. It simply stated the surveyors would come. The words might as well have been a hand reaching over my fence to take what it pleased. I folded the letter once, then again, setting it on the table without looking at Elias. He leaned back the chair, groaning under his weight. "I've seen 3 others like it this week," he said, his voice carrying the wear of too many hard rides. "Small holders, mostly widows or men too old to ride fence. They're counting on folks not having the means to fight." His eyes met mine, steady, but edged with something like warning. "Crow's been meeting with railroad men near every week in the courthouse. They've got coin enough to buy the rest of the council if they haven't already." The fire in the stove popped, sending a faint warmth across the room, though it didn't reach the cold sitting between us. Samuel's footsteps thudded softly in the loft above the boards, giving away where he stood listening. I didn't call to him. There was no gentling this news. Elias looked toward the stairs, then back to me. "You could come stay on my south pasture till this blows over," he offered, though we both knew it was a kindness without much defense behind it. I shook my head, sliding the envelope toward the lamp. The paper caught the light, that red seal now broken, but still sharp against the cream. "If they want my ground," I said quietly, "they'll have to walk it themselves," and look me in the eye. Elias didn't argue, but his glance toward the dark window told me he was measuring how soon that might happen. He stayed a while longer, speaking of a neighbor up near the ridge, whose barn had been measured without so much as a knock on the door. Crow had called it a mistake, though no one believed it. The talk of the town was shifting. Some were selling ahead of the survey, afraid of losing everything for a fraction. Others dug in, sharpening their tempers for the fight ahead. By the time Elias rose to leave, the air outside had grown colder still, his horse shifting restlessly at the hitch. At the door he paused. "I'll keep my ear to the ground," he said, pulling his gloves tighter. "If word comes about the survey crew, you'll hear from me first." Then he stepped into the dark, the sound of hooves fading down the frozen road. I stood at the window until the last echo was gone, the lamplight catching the frost gathering at the corners of the glass. The letter lay where I'd left it, the county's words sitting plain as day in my own kitchen. Samuel came down the stairs, his face pale in the light. "Are they really coming here?" he asked. I nodded once, not trusting more than that. His shoulders straightened a little, though he kept his eyes on the folded paper. He didn't speak again, just moved to bank the fire, the soft scrape of the poker the only sound in the room. I gathered the dishes from supper, stacking them by the basin. The motion was habit, a small thing to keep my hands busy while my mind measured what would come next. Outside, the wind carried the faint sound of a bell from the church in town, the slow toll marking the hour. By the time it faded, I had made up my mind to keep my place as it was for as long as the season allowed. When the lamplight began to waver, I trimmed the wick and set another log on the fire. The night had settled deep around the house, the kind of quiet that lets every small sound carry. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once, then stopped. I took the letter and set it in the top drawer of the cupboard, its presence there both a weight and a reminder. Samuel had gone back to the loft, his footsteps lighter this time. I sat by the stove a while longer, the warmth easing into my legs, listening to the crackle of the wood. Out beyond the cottonwoods, the snow had started to fall again, soft, against the frozen ground. I thought of Elias riding home through it, of the men in town talking under lamplight, about lines on a map that crossed other people's lives. A gust rattled the door in its frame, the latch holding fast. I rose and checked it anyway, my hand lingering on the wood. In the stillness that followed, I caught the faint rhythm of hooves again. Slower this time, measured coming up the road. Whoever it was, they weren't in a hurry. The shape of a rider moved against the pale line of the horizon, heading straight for my gate. The rider slowed at the gate, swinging down from the saddle with a careful motion that told me the trip had been long. Snow clung to the hem of his coat, the cold making his breath hang in the air. When he stepped onto the porch, I recognized Sheriff Amos Turner, his broad frame filling the space between the posts. He tipped his hat in greeting, though his eyes carried the same weight I'd seen in Elias Mercer's just hours earlier. "Evening, Clara," he said, his voice steady but low. "Mind if I step in a moment?" I opened the door, letting the warm air spill onto the porch. He brushed the frost from his shoulders and shut the cold out behind him. The sheriff's badge on his vest caught the lamplight as he crossed to the table. His gloved hands rested on the back of a chair, the leather creaking as he leaned forward. "I was in the mayor's office this afternoon." He began pausing as though choosing his words. "Crows signed the order to start them surveys sooner than folks figured. Crew's coming out in less than a week." The news sat heavy in the room. I glanced toward the loft, but Samuel didn't stir. Turner watched me closely, the lines around his eyes deepening. "I wanted you to hear it from me before they show up at your fence," he went on. "And there's more. They've hired on a man to oversee the work, name's Silas Grant. He's been known to push his way through when there's resistance." His tone left no doubt that trouble would follow this Grant, if given the chance. I set another log on the fire, the sharp scent of pine rising in the warm air. "Why tell me this tonight?" I asked. Turner's gaze shifted toward the window where the wind moved the shadows of the cottonwoods across the snow. "Because I reckon they'll start with the eastern parcels," he said, his voice quieter now. "And yours sits square in their path." He took the chair opposite me, removing his hat and setting it on the table. "I've been in this county long enough to know when men mean to keep their boots clean," he said. "They won't ask for permission. They'll step where they please." His words held no anger, only the plain certainty of someone who had seen such things before. The sheriff stayed a while, speaking of other families who'd been visited by the crew in years past. Some had given in, selling at a fraction of their land's worth. Others had stood their ground until legal papers forced their hand. Each story ended the same way: the railroad took what it wanted, and the town grew around it. Turner didn't offer false comfort. He only promised to be near when the men arrived. When he rose to leave, he pulled his coat tight, bracing for the cold. At the door, he paused. "Clara, keep your gates shut and your stock close in. If Silas Grant rides through before the crew, I want word sent to me right off." I nodded, and he stepped into the dark, the sound of his boots on the porch fading beneath the steady wind. I watched him mount up, his figure soon swallowed by the night. The yard was still again, the snow untouched, save for the tracks leading to my door. I barred it after him, the latch falling into place with a quiet click. The letter from the mayor's office was still in the cupboard drawer, its presence like a shadow in the room. Samuel came down the stairs, his hair mussed from sleep. "Was that Sheriff Turner?" he asked. I told him it was, and that the survey crew would be here sooner than we'd thought. He stood in silence a moment, then crossed to the stove and began tending the fire. The glow lit his face, and in it I saw the same set to his jaw that his father once had. We went about the rest of the evening in near silence, the sounds of the house filling the space between us, the scrape of the poker, the faint whistle of wind through the eaves, the creak of the rocker by the window. Outside, the snow had eased, leaving the yard under a pale, clear sky. The stars were bright enough to cast a faint sheen over the fence rails. Before turning in, I checked the barn. The cattle shifted softly in their stalls, the warmth of their breath hanging in the cold air. I slid the bolt on the barn door and stood a moment in the stillness, the only sound the distant call of an owl from the ridge. The night seemed calm, though the sheriff's words echoed in my mind. Back inside, I banked the fire low and made sure the door was fastened. Samuel had already gone back to the loft. The house settled into quiet, but it was the kind of quiet that felt thin, as if it could be broken without warning. I lay awake a long while listening for sounds beyond the wind. Near midnight, I thought I heard hoofbeats, far off, slow and deliberate. But they faded before I could be sure. Whether it was my mind playing tricks or the first sign of what was coming, I couldn't tell. By morning, I meant to walk the fence line myself. The lamp burned low on the table, its light pooling over the grain of the wood. The envelope in the cupboard stayed where it was, though its presence seemed to watch the room as much as I did. In the days ahead, strangers would ride through that gate, and each step they took on my ground would matter. For now the snow lay unbroken, but the tracks would come soon enough. The morning broke clear and cold, the kind of air that cuts sharp until the sun found its way over the ridge. I was already at the stove when Samuel came down, his boots scuffing against the steps. He pulled on his coat and hat without a word, and together we stepped out into the yard. The snow underfoot was crisp, the fences etched in white against the pale sky. I meant to walk the eastern line before the day was far along, to see for myself what shape the ground was in before any strangers put a boot on it. We followed the fence line past the cottonwoods, the frost catching in their bare branches. The land rolled gently down toward the creek, a thin sheet of ice forming along the shallows. Samuel walked a pace ahead, testing the rails as we went. By the time we reached the bend where the fence turned north, I saw the first sign of company fresh tracks cutting across the snow from the road. They weren't from townfolk I knew. The shoe marks were deeper, the stride longer. Whoever it was had passed through after midnight. We stopped at the rise overlooking the far pasture. In the distance, 3 riders sat their horses just beyond the fence, their silhouettes clear against the pale winter sun. They weren't moving toward us, only watching. Samuel shifted beside me, his breath hanging in the air. One of the men raised a hand, not in greeting, but as if marking that we'd seen them. Without a word, they turned their mounts and rode back toward the main road. Back at the house, I found Elias Mercer waiting near the porch rail. His coat was still dusted from the ride his mare tied at the post. "You've had visitors?" he said without needing to ask. I told him what we'd seen, and his jaw tightened. "Grant's likely sent men to get the lay of your place. He's done the same out toward Miller's Crossing." He stepped up onto the porch, lowering his voice. "They're looking for a way to press you before the crew comes." We moved inside, the warmth from the stove barely taking the edge off the talk. Elias said he'd heard that Silas Grant kept a small camp set up a mile east of town, close enough to reach any property in half a day's ride. The men he hired were paid to make folks uneasy to lay groundwork before any legal papers were handed over. "It's meant to wear you down," Elias said. "One way or another, they want you tired before you're called to stand." Samuel listened from the chair by the stove, his hands resting on his knees. I could see in his face the same mix of concern and determination I'd felt since the sheriff's visit. Elias leaned forward, his voice steady. "If you've a mind to hold, you'll need someone here when they ride through again. I can spare a hand for a few days." I thanked him, though I knew asking for help meant letting another family go without for a spell. By mid-afternoon, I walked out to the barn to check the tack. The leather straps hung stiff from the cold, the saddle blanket still smelling faintly of the last ride. I kept my hands busy mending a tear in the harness, the sound of the needle pushing through the thick hide grounding me in the work. Outside, the light had taken on the softer hue of evening, the air sharpening as the sun drew lower. Near dusk, Samuel came in from the yard to say a rider was coming down the road. I stepped to the porch and saw him, a lone figure in a dark coat, the brim of his hat pulled low, riding with a slow, measured gait. The horse was a rangy bay, its flanks damp from the climb out of town. When the rider drew closer, I could see the narrow set of his face, the cold glint in his eyes. He reined in at the gate, but didn't dismount. "Mrs. Donovan," he called, his voice carrying easily in the still air. "Name's Silas Grant. I believe you've been informed about the survey." His tone was polite in the way a man might be before setting a boot on your doorstep without leave. I told him I'd had the mayor's letter. He nodded, once his gaze moving past me toward the house and the barn beyond. "Good," he said. "We'll be through this way soon. Would save time if you had your boundary markers cleared." I didn't answer, and the quiet stretched between us. Grant's horse shifted, the leather of the saddle creaking. He gave a thin smile, touched his hat brim, and turned back toward the road. I watched him ride until the bend in the trail hid him from view. The tracks he left in the snow cut a clean line toward town. Inside the lamp threw long shadows across the table. The air was still, but the house felt smaller somehow, as if the walls knew what was coming. Samuel sat at the window, watching the last of the daylight fade. I hung my coat by the door, the weight of the day settling in my shoulders. Out beyond the cottonwoods, the snow caught the first light of the moon, bright against the dark line of the trees where the road disappeared. 2 days passed without another rider at the gate, though the feeling of being watched never left the yard. The snow had hardened in the cold, each step over it. Sounding sharper than before, Samuel and I kept to our work, hauling water from the pump and checking the fences after the last wind. It was late in the morning when Elias Mercer rode in from the north pasture, his horse blowing steam into the air. He swung down and tied the reins to the porch rail, his expression telling me the news wasn't good. "They've set a date," he said once inside. "Grant's crew will be at your east line before week's end." He unbuttoned his coat, warming his hands near the stove. "And they'll have a deputy with them to keep things civil." His tone made clear what sort of civility to expect. I poured him coffee and asked who'd be wearing the badge. Elias said it was Deputy Carl Hewitt, a younger man out of town who'd never ridden this far east before. "Crow's been pulling him into more of these matters," Elias added. "Likely because he's easier to sway." Samuel, seated at the table, looked up from oiling the latch on the barn door he'd brought inside. "Does that mean they can just walk in?" he asked. Elias met his eyes. "Only if you let them." The day stayed cold, a thin layer of clouds muting the light. I decided to ride into town to collect supplies we might need before the week was out. Samuel stayed behind to keep the stock close in. The road to town was quiet, the snow along the ditches marked with the tracks of wagons and the occasional rider. When I reached the mercantile, the air inside was warm with the smell of burlap and coffee beans. I was at the counter weighing out flour when I heard voices at the back. One of them was Silas Grant's, low and even speaking to someone I didn't recognize. "East line's clear except for a few trees," he said. "We'll have those down before midday." His companion muttered something I couldn't hear, followed by Grant's reply. "Doesn't matter what she says." The orders signed. I paid for my goods and stepped outside, the cold air closing around me. Across the street, the mayor's office window glinted in the pale light, a shadow moving inside. I mounted up, the leather creaking under me, and turned for home without looking back. By the time I reached the house, the light was thinning toward evening. Samuel had the barn doors closed and the lantern lit inside. As I stepped through the gate, I noticed fresh hoof prints leading away from the yard. Not Elias's and not mine. "Rider came by," Samuel said when I asked. "Didn't stop. Just went along the south fence and kept going." That night the wind rose, rattling the shutters and carrying the faint sound of a bell from town. I sat by the stove mending a tear in Samuel's coat, the needle flashing in the lamplight. The letter from the mayor's office was still in the cupboard, its folded edge beginning to curl. Elias's warning and Grant's voice in the mercantile stayed with me, each word adding weight to the days ahead. Morning came with a thin crust of snow over the yard. Samuel went to split kindling while I swept the porch clear. By mid-morning, a dark shape appeared on the road, moving at a steady pace. This time it was Sheriff Turner, his coat buttoned to the throat, eyes narrowed against the wind. He dismounted at the porch and stepped up without knocking. "They're on the move," he said simply. "Grant's crew left town at first light. I saw them take the East Fork." He set his gloves on the rail. "I'll be nearby when they reach your line, but I can't promise Crow won't press the deputy to favor them." He looked past me into the house. "Keep your gates fastened until you see them yourself." After he rode on, I closed the door and latched it, the sound sharp in the quiet. Samuel stood near the window watching the road. The sky was pale, the air still. Out by the cottonwoods, the snow lay untouched, but the day's tracks were coming. By the time the sun reached the cottonwoods, I could see them from the porch. 4 riders coming up the east road, in a straight line, their shadows stretching long over the frozen ground. Silas Grant rode in front, his dark coat buttoned tight, followed by 2 men I didn't recognize, and Deputy Carl Hewitt at the rear. Their horses moved at a steady walk, hooves striking the hard crust of snow with a dull rhythm. Samuel stood beside me until they were near enough for the sound of saddle leather to carry. I told him to see to the barn, then stepped down to meet them at the gate. Grant's eyes swept the yard, quick and measuring. "Morning, Mrs. Donovan," he said, voice smooth as polished wood. "We're here to mark the survey points." I kept my hand on the gate latch. "You've got no leave to cross this fence." His smile tightened, but he didn't look away. Hewitt shifted in his saddle, his gloved hand resting on the horn. "Ma'am, the order from the mayor's office allows it," the deputy said. "We're just following instruction." Elias Mercer appeared from the north path before I could answer, his gelding moving at a brisk trot. He swung down without a word, taking up position a few steps from me. Grant's gaze flicked between us, then he nodded toward one of his men who pulled a rolled canvas from his saddlebag. Inside were thin stakes with strips of red cloth tied to the tops. I told them again they wouldn't be setting foot past my fence without a writ signed by the county judge. Hewitt's mouth tightened. "That'll just slow things down," he said. Elias stepped forward, then his voice level. "Then I reckon it'll be slow." The air between the 2 lines of men held still, save for the breath of the horses. Grant leaned slightly in his saddle. "This can be easy or hard," he said, not raising his tone. "But the line will be marked." I let the quiet stand until the wind rattled the dry branches overhead. "Then you'll wait for the writ," I said. They stayed another moment, as if weighing whether to press the point, then Grant signaled with his hand. The men turned their horses, riding back the way they'd come. Hewitt was the last to go, his eyes meeting mine for a moment before he followed. Their tracks cut clean across the snow, leading east toward town. Elias stayed until they were out of sight. His mares is shifting under the weight of the cold. "They'll be back," he said simply. I nodded, already knowing it. Samuel came from the barn, his cheeks flushed from the cold, and looked between us. "Was that it?" he asked. "For today?" Elias said. The rest of the morning passed in the work that needed doing. Water hauled, wood split, and the stock fed. But every so often I'd glance toward the road, half expecting another line of riders to crest the rise. The stillness after their visit seemed almost too quiet, the kind that could break without warning. Late in the afternoon, a wagon rattled into view from the south. It was driven by Martha Keene, a neighbor from 2 miles off, her shawl pulled tight and her bonnet dusted with frost. She carried a basket of winter apples and a folded sheet of paper. "Found this posted outside the Mercantile," she said once inside, handing me the paper. It was a notice of intended entry for survey signed by Crow himself and tacked with the county seal. Martha stayed long enough for coffee, her voice low, as she spoke of 2 other families who'd already let the crew through rather than wait for court. "Said they didn't want the trouble," she murmured. When she left, the daylight was fading, her wagon wheels crunching over the snow until they were swallowed by distance. I set the notice on the table, its ink still dark against the pale paper. Samuel studied it without speaking, then asked if they could take the land if we refused to sign. "Not without a fight," I said. He nodded, though his eyes stayed on the folded sheet. As evening settled, Elias returned from checking his herd, bringing word that Grant's men had ridden back into town before nightfall. "They'll use the paper to press you next," he said, hanging his coat by the stove. The fire popped, sending a sharp scent of resin into the room. We ate supper with the wind at the shutters, the lamp casting a steady glow over the table. Out beyond the cottonwoods, the snow caught the last of the light before darkness took hold. I gathered the dishes, and listened to the quiet between the three of us, the kind that says more than words might. When I stepped onto the porch before turning in, the air was still and cold, the stars sharp above the ridge. Somewhere down the east road, a lone coyote called its voice, carrying clear across the frozen ground. The next morning broke under a low ceiling of gray, the kind that made sound travel far and slow. I was in the yard breaking ice from the water trough when I heard the first creak of wagon wheels on frozen ground. By the time I reached the porch, I could see them 2 wagons with the county seal painted on their sideboards, each drawn by a pair of heavy bays. Silas Grant rode ahead with Deputy Hewitt close behind their breath, and the horses' steam hanging in the cold air. They stopped at the gate without calling out. Grant dismounted his boots, crunching the snow, and unrolled a sheet of paper from his coat. "Mrs. Donovan," he said, holding it so the county seal caught the light, "this is the writ you asked for. We're here under full authority to begin." The deputy's gaze flicked from the paper to me, his expression caught between duty and unease. I stepped down to the gate, letting my hand rest on the top rail. "You've got your paper," I said. "Now you'll follow my terms while you're on my land." Grant's jaw worked once before he nodded. "We'll be quick." Behind him, the men on the wagons began unloading stakes coils of measuring chain and a transit on its tripod. Elias Mercer appeared from the north side, a few minutes later his horse tied just beyond the cottonwoods. He walked over without a word and stood to my left, his presence enough to make Grant glance his way. The crew moved past us toward the east fence, marking the ground with slow, deliberate care. I followed at a distance, noting each place they set a stake. By midday, the line they marked cut clean through my pasture, running from the cottonwood bend straight toward the creek. Samuel joined me at the far end, his breath clouding in the cold. "They're cutting the land in half," he said quietly. I nodded my eyes on the bright strips of cloth fluttering from the stakes. Grant called a halt not long after, saying they'd finished the primary line. As the crew gathered their tools, I stepped forward. "These stay where they are until the court sees them," I said. "No shifting, no pulling, no adding." Hewitt gave a short nod, his voice low. "Understood." The wagons rattled off toward town, the tracks they left running like scars through the snow. Elias lingered, his mare stamping at the cold. "They'll take this to Crow before the week's out," he said. "If you mean to answer, you'll need to be in that courtroom." I told him I'd be there, and he promised to ride with me. That evening, I gathered the notice, the writ, and the mayor's letter, laying them out on the table in the lamplight. Samuel sat across from me, his hands folded. "Will they listen?" he asked. I kept my eyes on the papers. "They'll hear me," I said. The fire popped in the stove, the only other sound in the room. Outside, the sky had cleared, and the moon lit the cottonwoods in silver. Somewhere in the distance, a single rider moved along the ridge, the faint rhythm of hoofbeats carrying on the night air. The morning of the hearing came cold and clear, the kind of day when sound carries sharp. Elias rode with me into town, our horse's breath turning white in the air. Samuel stayed behind to tend the place, though I knew his thoughts would be here. The courthouse sat at the far end of Main Street, its windows catching the low sun. Inside, the benches creaked under the weight of neighbors and ranchers come to see what might unfold. Sheriff Turner stood near the door, his eyes meeting mine with a quiet nod. At the front, Judge Halbrook took his place, the gavel's rap settling the room. Grant and Deputy Hewitt were already seated, the rolled survey map on the table between them. The mayor sat behind, hands folded, his expression unreadable. When called, I stepped forward and set the mayor's letter, the notice, and the writ before the judge. My voice carried steady as I spoke of the order arriving without consent, of men sent to mark a fence they had no right to cross, and of the harm it would do to split a working pasture in two. Grant answered with talk of progress and benefit to the county. But when the judge asked if the law allowed for such taking without fair price or true need, his reply faltered. Elias spoke next, his words plain telling of land worked honest for decades, and of the ruin left when the railroad cut through without care for those who kept it. When the judge's decision came, it was simple and final. The survey line was struck from the record. Any future entry would require written agreement from me or my kin, with fair price set by the court. Grant's jaw tightened, but he rose without a word. The mayor stood slower, his gaze sweeping the room before he followed him out. Outside, the air felt lighter. Turner stepped up beside me, his voice low. "They'll look elsewhere now. You held your ground." Elias untied our horses, and we rode home under a pale winter sun. The stakes still stood where the crew had left them. But before nightfall, Samuel and I pulled each one and stacked them by the barn. That night, the lamp cast a warm circle over the table as we shared supper. The papers from the courthouse lay in the cupboard, not as a warning, but as proof. Out beyond the cottonwoods, the snow lay smooth again, uncut by tracks. I've learned that on this land, holding what's yours isn't only about fences or deeds. It's about knowing when to stand and when to speak. And trusting that truth once told plain will take root. We'll keep working this place as we always have through winter winds and summer heat because it's ours in more than name. If you've ever faced a moment where you had to stand firm for what mattered most, I hope you remember quiet resolve can carry further than a raised voice. And if this story spoke to you, I'd be glad to have you stay and hear the next one.